Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to the first event in our webinar series, Shifting Paradigms, the Emergence of a Multipolar World Order and its Global Implications. My name is Merve Ispahani. I'm the Academic Programs Manager at Columbia Global Istanbul, and I'm delighted to open this series organized by Columbia Global's Istanbul and Amman centers and our Committee on Global Thought. For those of you who may not know, Columbia Global is a groundbreaking new initiative that brings together major entities from across Columbia, including our 11 global centers and the committee, to take on humanity's most complex challenges and foster intellectual inquiry. Our mission is to facilitate dialogue and research that connects scholarship with real-world challenges. Our global centers and the Committee on Global Thought are a critical part of that formula. Spanning 4 continents, the centers allow Columbia Global to serve as a platform for intellectual exchange, bridging regions and disciplines to address today's most pressing global issues. The committee was created to enhance the university's engagement with issues of global importance, recognizing that we need new thinking, paradigms, and concepts to understand our rapidly changing world. This series is a perfect example of what Columbia Global does well, bringing together leading academics, policymakers, and practitioners to explore the ways in which the global order is undergoing a fundamental transformation toward a more multipolar international system. These changes have profound implications for global governance, security, trade, and international institutions, making today's conversation both urgent and necessary. Our goal today is to foster a nuanced discussion grounded in history, yet forward-looking on how emerging powers will shape the international system in the coming decades. With that, I want to express my gratitude to today's panelists for lending their time and expertise. I will now hand the floor over to our distinguished moderator, Adam Tooze, the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History and Chair of the Committee on Global Thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merve, and it really is a great pleasure to be with you here this morning as the beginning of this series of conversations that we cooked up at a meeting of the Global Centers in New York last fall. It's a real pleasure to see this coming to life, and I look forward to a sustained conversation about the major urgencies facing us all, but from distinctive vantage points. The network that holds all of this together is Columbia-centered. So one element, one pole of that conversation is the United States, and specifically New York, and specifically Columbia, which, as you all know, if you've been following the news, is truly in the cockpit of the dramas of American politics at this current moment. And my determination, certainly as chair of CGT, and I know this is shared by the overwhelming majority of colleagues involved with CGT, is to open a space, not to close a space down, and above all, of course, to preserve the university as a privileged space of free speech against the intrusions of state power, against those of our students and faculty, and indeed former students, who are determined to exercise their rights under the American Constitution to free speech and open political dialogue. And obviously, I say that under the shadow of events that have gone on in New York in recent days, and in light of the fact that many of my graduate students and colleagues are actually concerned about coming to campus for fear of encountering the immigration services of the United States. So this is a grim and serious moment in which we meet. All the more important, I think, to open up this axis of conversation between New York, Columbia on the one hand, and our presence and our network in the MENA region. And that's really the theme for me of this series of conversations, is to find ways of talking about both the specific problems of the US and the MENA region, but more generally about issues of the globe from this multi-perspectival position. We will go back and forth on the panel for successive rounds of exchange, but we have an hour and 15 minutes scheduled for this event, and I hope that towards the end, with the help of the team managing this excellent event from the background, we'll be able to get some questions from the audience by way of the chat function. Actually, we didn't discuss the technicalities of this in advance, but I assume there is a way in which those can be brought in. If you're on the call, you will see the chat button at the bottom. It would be great if you could think about questions and put those there. It's my distinct honor to chair a really extraordinary group of scholars and thinkers to address this issue today. Starting in my top left with Solly Özel, who's a distinguished academic and commentator in international relations, originally from Turkey. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences, the IWM at Vienna, holder of many prestigious fellowships, prolific columnist, and contributed to outlets. I read him right now most often in the wonderful webpage of the Institut Montaigne, a French outlet, but a really great source for geopolitical thinking. He's also a member of the European Council of Foreign Relations, and we're colleagues in that. Next to him on my screen, I have Rami Khouri, who's a Palestinian Jordanian American analyst and journalist. During his 55 years career in journalism, he was the editor of the Jordan Times and the Daily Star in Beirut. He's written books, contributed reporting and opinion pieces from the Middle East to Financial Times, NPR, Al Jazeera Online. And his most recent book, co-edited with Helena Cobban, could not be more timely or urgent, and really demands serious consideration and debate, understanding Hamas and why that matters. Thank you very much for joining us. Third on our panel is Ahmed Abadou, who's an associate fellow with the Chatham House Middle East outfit and the North African program there. He's based in London. He is also responsible for the China Studies Research Unit at the Emirates Policy Center. So a thinker who is straddling both the European and the Middle Eastern scene with a particular focus on issues to do with China. I read his posts regularly on the Chatham House website, and I found them extremely useful in making sense of the flux of proposals, some more grotesque than others, for the future of the Gaza crisis, which is on all of our minds as we meet. So truly an honor from my side to be chairing this panel. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the global centers in Amman and Istanbul who have been instrumental in pulling this panel together and for helping us to create this opportunity to think together. The title under which we're meeting and our audience will expect us to immediately address. Right now, in the current situation, there's a constant challenge of navigating between the big questions that we know we should be focused on and whatever outrage happens to come across the screen at any given moment. The big picture question that we thought we should start our conversation with is the question of multipolarity. I'm confirmed out there on record. It's deeply baked into my recent efforts to make sense of the world that this is a real thing, that this is a real trend, that this is powerful and a key driver of what's going on. It's a key driver to my mind, in part because the difficulty that the United States is having in adjusting to a more multipolar world is crucial, I think, to understand the tensions that dominate US policy. And those affect, I would argue, every side in the American policy debate. In fact, in many ways, I think it is, in fact, the Democratic policy elite which has the harder time accommodating itself to a truly complex multipolar world than the rather crude, cartoonish, some would say, vision of the world offered by MAGA and Trump. In any case, I take this to be one of the central tensions of our current moment, and one which, as a historian of the contemporary world, is not new, right? It's one which traces back in American policy thinking to as early as the 1970s, recurs in various forms in the even at the moment of unipolarity, where the smartest thinkers in the Clinton team are actually anticipating a world which will be more complex and more multipolar. And that's part of what animates their drive towards global solutions, is the sense that the moment of American unipolarity may be passing. Under Obama, I think, in retrospect, we rather underestimate, maybe this looked different from the Muslim and the Islamic world, but we rather underestimated in Europe, I think, the extent to which the core elements of policy around Obama, perhaps not around Hillary Clinton, but around Obama, actually reflected a rather sober assessment of the diminishing power of the United States. My sense is that we've been living in the sequence of Trump, Biden, Trump, through a kind of double atavism. An atavism in the sense of a return of a rather simplistic Atlanticist unipolar version, a kind of unipolar classic vision with Biden, sandwiched between the crudity and the violence of the Trump vision on either side. In any case, I think this is an urgent question, and from preliminary discussions, I already know how how engaging and how important this is for our panelists. So maybe I could just ask people to start by giving us like your initial take on this question of multipolarity and how you understand its basic dynamics. Maybe folks can give us just a sort of brief glimpse on whether you find this idea useful. Maybe I'll start with Solly from your vantage point. How do you find this a useful way of framing our current moment?
Well, even if, I think independent of whether or not one finds it useful, there is no doubt that the unipolar moment is over, and there are now other centers of power, both economically and strategically. And that's only normal. Back when the wall fell, China still was, what, 2.5 to 3% of the world economy. Today, it is 18 to 19% of the world economy. Russia was in shambles in the 1990s. It no longer is. It may have other problems. And the United States, for reasons of its own mistakes, misadventures and stuff, has lost a lot of power and a lot of prestige as well, although it is quite remarkable that the US, with only 3-4% of the world's population, 80 years after the end of the Second World War and the rise of Europe, Japan, China, India, and all the rest, still is 24-25% of the world economy. And that's, I think, where the problems begin in terms of discussing the current age. I probably do not concur much with your assessment of the Obama administration. Recognizing relative decline does not mean you are absolved of your responsibility to mitigate that decline and actually to manage it so that you could actually lay out the framework for a new order. What I think we're going to be faced with is whether or not you can take, in spite of the fact that MAGA is more introverted and all that, can you take the desire, the urge, the obsession with primacy that American foreign policy has held, particularly, obviously, after the Second World War? And I'm not sure that either the Democrats or the Republicans of all type, whether the old Republican elite or the new ones, are necessarily rid of that particular obsession for American primacy, which then suggests to me it may be difficult to have a tripartite arrangement whereby the three great powers, and I'm not quite sure how great Russia actually is, if we're going to look at it with full aspects of sources of power, that they would be happy with sharing, if you will, the world with the spheres of influence thing. Now, what I think is remarkable about our time, and that is particularly because of American policies, not only are the challengers, that is China and Russia, revisionist powers, the dominant power is a revisionist power. It actually does away with the rules and institutions that itself has set up, thinking that these are now obstacles rather than propellers of or amplifiers of American power. And I see that the debate is really shaping around that by many who think that this is not really the way to approach. The questions about multipolarity, of course, is that I consider, or my view of the multipolarity that is emerging or that is already with us, that it is an asymmetric multipolarity. Regional powers today have a lot of leeway. They can say no, they can actually maneuver, they can actually hedge. Some people are also calling this current system a system of hedgers, if you will. But the thing is, if ever the distribution of power in the new political economy and the new strategic reality of the world is consolidated, I think all those middle powers will have a lot less space to actually do as they please, or to be able to play one power against the other. And that is what I think we should be looking at from now on. And given the fact that there are also global problems that need to be attended to with some degree of cooperation, the bullying style, I don't think will lead us to a better world, and at some point it will backfire. And this is particularly true, I think, and this is my final point. The mistreatment of European allies, the desire to break the European Union, to actually try to redefine the West as a more masculine, not effete, not liberal, quote unquote, civilization, will also have repercussions in Asia, where the Biden administration in particular tried to make up for the ruins of that the first Trump administration left behind. If trust is lost in the United States, can it ever be recovered as easily? And that is going to be a big challenge. But so far, the wrecking crew doesn't seem to mind the possible future problems that the style might actually engender.
Thank you so much, Solly, for that fantastic overview. I like very much this central kind of organizing question of, okay, if the current moment is characterized by hedging, is there a larger logic we can trace that will itself constrain the future of that model? At what point do we get recoagulation, reconsolidation of power? Rami, it will be fantastic to get your take on this.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to be part of this panel and honored to speak right after Solly. I would add a couple of, I'd make 4 basic quick points in the beginning. I think using a multipolar model for the whole world is only partially useful, because what we're actually seeing, what I'm seeing from the Middle East, but with my constant travels to Europe and North America, is that the changes are global, regional, and internally, nationally. When you have powers that arise out of fragmenting nation states like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, and others, this is a new phenomenon, which is nation states or states that fragment, and within them a new sovereignty and a new power center emerges, which impacts the region. And the US has gone to war against these powers. So global, regional, national trends. The second one, the fraying of global institutions strikes me as really one of the most significant recent developments. It's kind of been going on for maybe 10 years, 15 years, but it's become much more clear now with the Gaza situation, and particularly with the Israeli defiance of international law, the UN, all the norms of global decent conduct, and the US supporting it wholeheartedly. So the fracturing global, the fraying, the slow disappearance of seriously impactful global institutions is an important element. The third one is that I think what I notice is the a triumph, not so much of several global power centers, but the triumph of what Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl set off in 1980, which is the triumph of a materialistic capitalism that is sheltered and promoted by global deregulated markets. So what you have now is this global capitalist spree all over the world, which is bringing prosperity to many people, super prosperity to a few people, and growing poverty to a lot of people. And this is the dominant trend that I see everywhere. It's no accident that the main factors that Trump is using in his foreign policy initially are economic, sanctions, tariffs, Riviera on the Gaza, selling property. I mean, these are capitalist rather than ideological factors. So that's the second thing that we need to keep in mind. The third one is I think that actually, sorry, I have 5 points. The third one is that wait a minute.
That was your
You're on
number
four.
three.
Okay,
If I'm checking the materialism was your number three, so you may have
Right.
two.
Right. The fourth one is I think that Gaza now, what we've seen in Gaza in the last 18 months or whatever it is, and the many years before that, but particularly in the last 16, 17 months, indicates not by what the Israelis have done or the Palestinians, but what the British and the Germans and the Americans have done, indicates to me and to many other people that the imperial era has never ended. The imperial colonial rules that governed the world for many years, since Napoleon came in and was attacking Lebanon and Egypt and Syria in 1798, for nonstop for a century and a half, we've had this Western powers, not just Western, because you also get the Russians, you get others. The imperial rules still dominate, and they're coming to the fore in an important way. And then my last point is that because of Gaza, because of the excesses of the Israelis and their American, it's really an American-Israeli joint plausible genocide. Because of that, because of the impact of the Western world, which has silently watched this happen without doing anything, and the inability of the global institutions to do anything, what we're noticing is a revived resistance all across the global South and in many parts of the global North. A new Gallup poll a few days ago showed that something like half of the American people support equal statehood for Palestine and Israel. This is historically important. When half of the American public wants a Palestinian state next to an Israeli state, that's really significant. It hasn't filtered up to the policymaking. When I was in college in the US in the 1960s, people didn't know what Palestinians were. The 67 war, they said, oh, these Arab states are trying to destroy Israel. And I would be debating the Jewish students and the pro-Israeli students and universities saying, well, this is about Palestine. They say, what's Palestine? So we've gone from a situation where nobody knew anything about Palestinians. They didn't exist in the Western psyche, to the point today where half of the American population supports a Palestinian state, and something like 40, 50% support arms embargoes on Israel. So Gaza has been central to the development of global sentiments and political positions that have driven a resistance movement that is political, economic, social, cultural, and Gaza is the quest for justice for Gaza and Palestine is the leading global movement now, more than civil rights, more than gender rights, more than climate change. It is the global movement that inspires people. And you had this guy on Big Ben 2 days ago. So these are the main points I would make as we analyze these dynamics to look at all these different factors.
Thank you so much, Rami. This really is opening up into a fascinating conspectus. Augmenting what Sully said, I particularly liked your emphasis also on these sort of longer term trajectories of change or lack of change, both the imperial structures, but then also within those, as you've made, this is a point you've made in several different places, that the fundamental defining feature of the current moment for all of the massacre that has been perpetrated and its support by the power in the West, is in fact a shift in public opinion such that the argumentative balance has fundamentally shifted and is moving. And that in itself is a really fundamental historical force. Ahmed, it would be great to get your vantage point on this as well.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you for CGC in Istanbul and Amman for this great invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. I already learned a lot from Soil and Rami, and the disadvantage of being the last speaker box you in whether you agree or disagree with him because they raised great points. So I would like to be very quick, and I would like to start by this hot take that MAGA in the United States essentially is a form of borrowing the China rejuvenation of the nation playbook. And to understand, from my view, where we are navigating or where we're going in this shift in the global order, we have to understand first the dynamics domestically in the United States and China, especially, given that although we are speaking now about a multipolar world order, and I agree completely with what the previous speaker said, I still think that we are still dealing with the most significant two powers in the region, in the world, which is the United States and China, which will have implications going forward on this process of shifting that is happening in the global order. And I want to start with the United States. And if you look at the most important policy points that this administration is focusing on, it's trying to avoid a debt crisis in the United States by reducing or cutting spending and reducing the size of the government, federal government. At the same time, they're trying to reindustrialize and shift the US economy from service-based economy to manufacturing-based economy. At the same time, we have an inclination inside this government towards centralization and towards following or towards an environment where opposition to the head of the administration, which is the president in this case, is minimal, unlike what we've seen in Trump 1.0 administration. In China, we could see similar contours in Xi Jinping's policy. We could see an inclination towards centralization and sidelining all possible opposition within the Communist Party's rank and file. We could see also a shift from emphasis that the power should be with the government, the ministries and institutions, towards centralization of this power in the Communist Party institutions. We could also see a huge emphasis on industrialization, and the symptoms of that is overcapacity and China trying to export itself out of an economic crisis that is also based on trying to sort out a debt crisis. So in many ways, Trump, in my view, looked at China and saw that this model is actually worked. And he came in with this administration trying to revitalize this industrial base. And we could see that in the integration of this goal into the United States foreign policy. For example, the ongoing weakening of Europe deliberately, partially is based on achieving the objective of trying to pressure Europe to relocate their industrial base into the United States and to invest more into the United States to achieve the objective that Trump thinks he can get. One other example is the debate now in the United States about the necessity to freeze the conflict around Taiwan by reaching some sort of deal or agreement with China. And the emphasis or the driver behind that is the TSMC chip industry that Trump has brought up in his interviews many times and mentioned that it is unfair they control 90% of their production of advanced chips all over the world, and the fear in the United States and in this administration particularly to end up relying on China when it comes to advanced chips in the case of China taking Taiwan by force. And we could see also the same motive in Ukraine and the mineral deals. Now the world is relying on China, whether we like it or not, when it comes to rare earth minerals. And there is this push in the United States that we should break this reliance by freezing the Ukraine conflict and sign an agreement with Ukraine on the minerals. How does that impact foreign policy? I think, or the global order in general, I think there is an increased compatibility in Trump's foreign policy vision with both Xi Jinping's and Putin's visions. And that is a shift from liberal internationalism to neoclassical realism. And I know this debate is not academic, but I'm not going to go deeper into what does that mean. But neoclassical realism, in short, has emphasis on power, especially material power, and we're talking here about military power, and national interest as the center of foreign policy, spheres of influence, and the balance of power. And this has characterized Xi Jinping and Putin's strategic thinking since they came to power. And now we are seeing the United States adopting a fundamental shift in the foundations of the United States foreign policy towards adopting the same vision.
Ahmed, if I may, can I ask you, since China is one of your key areas of expertise, and you are one of the many hats that you wear, is centered in the Emirates. Could you perhaps speak for a few minutes to the way in which that logic of Chinese economic growth that you so productively axed your analysis on, how that, in the spirit of Rami's points about the multidimensional quality of the current multipolar moment, how that energizes the emergence of middle powers in the Gulf. The Emirates is often cited as a key instance of this. The Emirates emerging as a player, for instance, in the Sudan conflict, prior to that in Yemen, is after all a really remarkable historical development, not in the very long stretch of history, but in more recent history. And it's hard, at least from the outside, to see that as independent from the dynamic in the fossil fuel sector, oil and gas, that is ultimately driven by the demand from China. So I see there a Rami-style kind of nested pattern of causation where the big sucking sound in China unleashes dynamics of state formation and power concentration in the Gulf. Does that make sense from your vantage point?
I think we are seeing now, as one of the speakers really, I think Shoail really pointed out rightly, that we are living in a system of hedgers. And one of the main players in the global south generally are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, if you're talking about the Gulf here. And this opportunity has opened up, in my view, since China's BRI launching in 2013, which opened up a lot of opportunities for these countries when it comes to economic cooperation, trade, investments from Chinese companies. And the main thing that is actually, and I agree with you in terms of the transformation in state behavior, especially, is also domestic in the Gulf, given that the high level of compatibility between the economic restructuring that is happening now in China and the visions 2030 that are also happening in the Gulf at the moment towards less reliance on oil. So we could see that because of the similarities in the centralized political decision-making process, both in China and the Gulf, we could see this compatibility is very high in the cooperation between both sides, that it gave these countries the space to hedge and more options to balance some of the aspects of the United States foreign policy in the region. And I'm not here talking about China turning into a major security player in the Gulf. This is not going to happen. China is not interested, doesn't have the capabilities for that. But I'm talking about the normative offerings that China is putting forward to the global South through the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative that defies the human rights, democracy principles, and the liberal aspect of the world order. So, in many ways, it was a positive thing that China has risen under Xi Jinping since 2013, at least, for these countries. But at the same time, it was also very good for China's cooperation with these countries to see the United States committed to its security umbrella in the Gulf. And by that, I mean being able to do business and pour billions of dollars into this sensitive region and making sure that oil and gas flows continue to go to China and power the Chinese economy wouldn't have happened without the US security umbrella. And I would go as far as suggesting that any alteration or change in this security umbrella would be a great threat to Chinese interests.
That's a very interesting angle. Rami, I wanted to maybe make an arc between what Ahmed has just said and your observations, in which I kind of sensed something of a tension, because at one level you could say the Abraham Accord kind of vision of the pacification of the Israeli-Arab relationship over the silencing marginalization of the Palestinian question goes very much in Ahmed's kind of direction and towards that line that you were arguing for of commercialism, consumerism as the fundamental, the base note of our current moment that holds everything together. But then on the other hand, you are a specialist and a thinker who is trying to understand what Hamas is about. And you also, in your final comments, said, well, look, Gaza has become a center, essentially the center through which resistance is thought worldwide, which is its own kind of globalization dynamic, oppositional globalization dynamic, an oppositional dynamic which clearly can't be reduced to the vision of consumerism and infrastructural connection that was so fundamental to the Abraham Accords and to the more serious versions of the future of Israel's relationship with the Arab world than the Riviera on the Gaza kind of vision, right? Because there is a serious infrastructural vision there that fits very much with the blurring of the lines that Ahmed has outlined for us. How do you, when you're thinking about Hamas in your work, how do you situate Hamas as a global actor or as an actor in this multipolar world that we're all in various ways sketching? And how do you account for the shocking, for many people, I think, profoundly surprising way in which it has exploded over the last 2 years to be the central issue for resistance politics? Is there a way in which we can link these different dimensions of analysis?
Yeah, there probably is, and we'd have to kind of think about it some more, work on it. But I think what I see following this, not just in the last 16 months, but for the last 60 years of my life, watching this closely and dealing with it and knowing the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arabs, the Americans. So I've been in touch with people all over the place. I think what we're seeing now is due mainly to the Hamas's response to the really outrageous Israeli and American and British supported policies of the last 50, 60 years of nonstop settlement expansion, attacks on Palestinians, starving the Palestinians, siege to Gaza, etc. We've seen now half a century or more of clearly Israeli aggressive policies that deny the existence and the rights of the Palestinians and affirm the strategic priority that Israel should enjoy, not only in Palestine, but in South Lebanon and in Syria and in any developments, Iraq, Iran, anything in the region that happens that bothers the Israelis, they have the right to attack it, and the Americans presumably support them. So I think you have to see the conflict in its continuity over the years to understand what's going on right now. The reason I think Hamas did what it did in October 2023 is because it saw the trends continuing and no sign of change. And they'd been under siege for 12, 15 years in Gaza. And they needed to, as one of the scholars that we interviewed in our book said, they had to roll the dice. They had to break this process. And what happened in October 7 was way beyond what they were planning. They were planning to just grab some soldiers, bring them back, and negotiate for, as they've done many times with the Israelis. But the reason that there's so much global support for the the support is for Palestinian equal rights with Israel. The support is not to destroy Israel or kill Jews, as many Israelis would say. The support is for equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians living peacefully in two states and ending Palestinian refugeehood. The reason there's so much global support is because many of the people in the global South understand what happens under a colonial imperial system. They've experienced it. And they see this as they see the Palestinian resistance, especially Gaza, Hamas especially, as the last great anti-colonial battles. There are some other colonial situations in the world where people are struggling for their rights, but this is the most prominent because of the involvement of the West and the severity of what the Israelis are doing. So I think you can't avoid history, the historical markers. The Iranians similarly, remind you of what happened in 1953, 54, the overthrow of their democratic system. The Syrians will tell you in 1920, the French came and bombed Prince Faisal when he was trying to set up a constitutional democracy with a monarchy, with a leader, a figurehead king, but democratic elected. So this is why I say the imperial colonial dynamics persist, and people don't want them to persist. In the end, Hamas, like the people of Israel, like the people of Egypt, like the Kurds, they just want to live a normal life. They don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be sanctioned. They don't want to be threatened and treated like colonial slaves. They just want to live a normal, decent life. And if they're not going to be given that opportunity through the existing mechanisms of global interaction, they're going to take provocative actions to bring it about. But it's much better. And Trump, one of the few things where I support Trump, understands that you have to talk to Hamas to see what they want. If the U.S. had talked to the Viet Cong in 1963 or the Taliban in the 1980s, before launching these wars, it would have saved millions of lives and destruction and all around the world and terrible things. But they didn't. And here's a chance where the U.S. can talk to Hamas, understand really what they want, and they seem to be doing that. I mean, just yesterday, the American negotiator for hostages said this is what we're trying to do, to understand what's their bottom line and what do they want, and can we find a middle ground. This is eminently sensible and realistic, and I hope it continues.
Rami, thank you so much. I see your hand, Ahmed, but I'm desperate to bring Solly back into the conversation. And it was when Rami, you said, that fundamentally to understand Hamas's, the extraordinarily violent move on October 7th in 23, you have to understand in some senses that they just need to roll the dice. They need to break the status quo. And it brought back to mind, Sudhi, your opening comment about the extraordinary problem interpreting the current moment is that the United States is the revisionist power. And in some senses, there is almost, I mean, it seems, please don't misunderstand this analogy, and I don't mean it in a facetious way. But when we think about what the Trump administration is doing, and when we try and rationalize what they're doing, I often do find myself saying something along those lines, which is they are, in their own perverse way, convinced that only if they just do something can they break out of the current impasse, an impasse which they themselves understand. And I guess this is absurd, right? But they understand the current situation as exploitative, unbearable, as needing change. And there's a willingness to take risks to disrupt. I mean, is that what I guess I'm trying to do is lay out what an analytic of America's revisionism would look like. If we accept your basic diagnosis that that is one of the truly defining and weird aspects of the current moment, what is the nature of that revisionism? It almost by definition must be a particular type of revisionism because it's essentially being launched from a position of strength rather than weakness.
Thank you for this question. To answer it will take a lot longer, so I'll just limit myself with some aspects of it. And I'll start with what Rami said in his opening statement. That is, you write about economics. You wrote a lot about how Bidenism was not necessary, or Bidenomics was not necessarily going to succeed because you could not really bring back manufacturing to the United States. All you could do was to train your workforce so that they could actually be operational in an advanced service economy, okay? And that is maybe a good starting point because if the first revisionism is about the United States no longer willing to be constrained by the rules and institutions that itself has set up, the second part of that revisionism is techno industry wanting to have in no way being constrained by anything. And that is, if you will, the economic side of the attack against the European Union. The regulatory force of the European Union is something that the new rising power of the capital segment that's not what they want, okay? And in that sense, I think we will also be witnessing an intra-capital or intra-corporate fight in the United States as well, because this is not going to be something that everybody is going to be laying down. I want to add one other thing to what both Rami and Ahmed said, just to complement. One of the problems that I see is that all powers are vulnerable. They have a lot of vulnerabilities, whether they're big powers, they're small powers. Everybody has vulnerabilities. And the thing is, whose vulnerabilities are going to be better managed may actually give us a better answer in terms of what we are going to be ending up with. And in that sense, and I do agree with Rami that to approach the Middle East as if it were a colonial playground is just not going to pay off. I mean, at the end of the day, you react to October 7, you want to decimate Hamas, and the outgoing Secretary of State of the United States says that Hamas has recruited as many people almost as they have lost. If they lost 20,000 people, in the same period, they've recruited close to 20,000 people, and then 28,000 civilians, many of them women and children, have been killed, murdered, or have been decimated. And Gaza is not a livable place. And the idea of turning it into a Riviera without the Palestinians there, so long as the Palestinians stay there, it's an unwinnable game. Okay, but something happened, and I relate to this to what Ahmed said, and that is the Iranians tried to build a hegemonic order in the Middle East, and they then prompted the Gulf countries in particular to side with Israel for their own protection. And what the Israelis did in the past 17 or 18 months was to destroy the Iranian scheme, if you will. And now they want to implement a Pax Hebraica. They are in Lebanon, in Mount Hernon. They are in Lebanon, they are in Syria, Mount Hernon. It's highly unlikely they're going to leave anytime soon. My view is it's just not going to work either, not any more than the Iranian one, which was way beyond their capacities. And in that sense, maybe in that sense, should we understand what the Trump administration did by overriding Bibi Netanyahu and the state of Israel and speaking with Hamas directly, and therefore putting a limit to what the Israelis may wish to do. And that may have something to do, and maybe Ahmed and Rami can speak to this, that may have something to do with the fact that Saudi Arabia still represents a big interest for the United States, and the Saudis, I don't think, are necessarily comfortable with the Israeli project in its entirety, particularly in terms of attacks against Iran.
I mean, thank you so much, Sully. I mean, I'm tempted as a historian to say that it's difficult to think of any moment in which the Western imperial project, starting with the British and the French, actually worked in any way functionally in the region, right? It's somewhat different for the Gulf states, which could be, as it were, constructed almost de novo and then equipped retrospectively with the oil industry that could essentially be run offshore. And Iran, of course, is sui generis and in a completely different category. But the Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine problem is it's not a zone in which imperial power has functioned well at any point, right? It's actually a continuous from the point of view of the imperial powers themselves. It has not been a zone of successful imperial power exercise. And
I want to add just one thing, and this is to complement Rami's thinking. You know, the Western orders, which been there for at least a couple of centuries, if not 300, made moral claims, whether one accepted them or not. But in Gaza, this has now been buried. It's buried under the rubble of Gaza, which means sheer violence or sheer force is now the currency of international relations, and that's very dangerous for the world, number one. And number two, can Europe, dissociated or rejected by the United States, rise as a moral power when it was really silent when the calamity was taking place in Gaza? That is an intriguing question, because it is important that Europe emerges as a potential fourth force for better balancing in the world. But can it really do it? And with what resources it will do it intrigues me. And then that, I guess, we will see in the next few years.
Ahmed, I feel bad about cutting you off earlier, apart from the fascination of hearing Solly's answers. But do you want to come back in?
Yes, I would just say quick words about the Gaza situation, Hamas, and let me say that I agree with everything that has been said so far. I would just want to add that it is in the heart of our discussion, to answer your question about Hamas and how it fits in all these dynamics, about the shift in the global order. Because when you speak to Palestinian friends and thinkers, the thing that they really agree on is that the post-Cold War world order was not in favor of the Palestinians, right? And two-state solution would have happened if the US adopted a different foreign policy, a different approach to the Middle East. Now, this foreign policy, one of the things that it helped maintain is the regional the regional order based on the Arab regimes, essentially. And from Hamas' point of view, this is not in favor of its ideology. And now I'm no longer talking about the two-state solution. I'm talking about its own ideology and position and its resistance narrative. That's why you could see Hamas very comfortable dealing with Iran, and later on during the Gaza war going to China to try to sign what is called Beijing Declaration. Now, the only solution from a Palestinian perspective is a change in the world order or a change in sentiment in the United States domestically. The consensus now is that the latter is not going to happen anytime soon. And the hope is pinned on the shift being faster in the world order so that the Palestinians would have more options and the United States hegemonic mediator role being the sole arbiter in this conflict would decimate. And we could have more powers playing a role in the creation of the Palestinian state. And I would only add to what Soil rightly said about the Saudis not feeling comfortable. I completely agree with him, and I would add that that doesn't mean to me that normalization is not going to happen. It's too early now to judge if normalization with Israel is going to happen or not. It seems to me that the Trump administration has great emphasis on normalization still to happen. And this feeds into a bigger vision that this administration inherited from the Biden administration, which is Israel primacy in the Middle East. But I would add that normalization doesn't necessarily mean alignment. So if the Saudis would, from a national interest perspective, sign this deal to get a defense pact with the United States and the nuclear program they were promised, and they have to get this past Congress, that doesn't mean that they're not going to balance against this policy of Israel by maintaining their rapprochement with Iran and deepening their ties with Turkey, for example.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I have a list of really fascinating questions from the audience. Thank you so much for these. One that really stands out for me, and it's directly in relation to this conversation that we've been having right now, and it's by Dinu Beslio, and it relates to something that Solly said in regards to the possible tripartite division, how much this sort of world division would limit the capacity of maneuver by smaller powers. And then the question really comes to its very interesting point. Would this be considered in contrast with the Cold War, where the ideological expansionist policy of both sides allowed the actors in between a high degree of autonomy and in fact could act as a kind of mobilizing device? I was thinking here, Ahmed, about your point about the way in which the end of the Cold War shifted, the position of the Palestinian movement, which in the 70s and 80s could maneuver in between the blocks and loses that freedom, loses that autonomy, and in fact collapses in the early 1990s in a near state of bankruptcy, right? Because it's lost external funding of a very important kind. It also goes to Solly's question about values in this new order. How far do they matter? How far are they any longer an organizing force? And to Rami's point about resistance, like what are the ideologies that will shape the dynamics of this current moment? I mean, this was directed to you, Solly, in the first instance. Do you see a difference here in the way in which this tripartite world operates as opposed to the logic of the bipartite Cold War, if that's not too coarse a simplification, and the way in which ideology there could serve as a flywheel for autonomy?
I'm afraid I don't agree with the premise of the question that during the bipolar era, those that did not by treaty belong to either side had actual autonomy. I mean, India was supposed to be the epitome of autonomy. India was very closely aligned with the Soviet Union. Korea was supposed to be part of the South, but it was obviously aligned with the United States, or in Argentina or in Brazil. So I think the end of the Cold War did allow other powers to be able to move around, and particularly this transitional period was a boom for a country such as Turkey to be able to pursue its national interests without having to think about alliance obligations. And a South Africa or a Brazil or an India could actually perform in ways that maybe they really couldn't in a bipolar environment where the system was tight. My hunch is the amount of space that has been open to medium powers now, once the distribution of global power has been set up, will be shrunk, and they will have a lot less room for maneuver. You even see this in this so-called alternative, at least economic organization, BRICS. There are definitely clashes of interest between, on the one hand, Russia and China, which may also have their own clashes, and also India and Brazil, which are the original members of the BRIC. in that the first two are revisionist, whether the other two, and to a certain extent South Africa, are reformist powers. And what do the Chinese do? They expand the BRICS, and none of the new members are necessarily natural allies of either Brazil or India. So,
yeah, Rami, you want to come in on this?
Yes, I'd like to add one element before this continues in the direction of bipolarity, multipolarity, etc. And I think what I see the most significant development in the Arab world, but also the wider Middle East, that I've experienced in these last 55 years that I've been reporting from there and traveling all over the place. And it's the most significant dynamic that drives all of these other things, which is the gradual fraying at the edges and the internal corrosion of most of the sovereign Arab states. I don't want to call them nation states because most of them are not nation states, but some of them are. But the state system that was created a century ago by the European powers mostly, with a few locally created ones, is fraying. It's not collapsed, but if you look around the region, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and probably one or two others that I forgot, they're all going through serious processes of severe fragility, internal fracturing and fragmentation, to the point where we have independent Arab states, but not really sovereign Arab states. And because any Arab country that wants to make a serious sovereign decision which armaments to buy, where to make a free trade agreement, they have to get the approval of some foreign patron. And if it's not a foreign patron like the US or Russia, it's a regional patron like Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Israel. So what we're seeing really, and the reason this is happening, the deeper problem, which I think today is the number one challenge, which almost no Arab country is addressing seriously, is the pauperization and massive inequalities within most of the Arab countries, other than the energy-driven small oil states or big oil states who have a lot of money. So and the data is increasingly clear from UN and other impartial sources. We're talking about 65, 70% of Arab citizens, and this goes up to 85% in the non-oil states. 65, 70% of all Arabs don't have enough money to meet their basic monthly needs of food, water, medicine, schooling, and shelter. This is an extraordinary situation, which is new, and it's getting worse. And you're getting 80, 90% informal labor rates. So all kinds of indicators of the pauperization, and this leads to desperation. And that's why you get groups like Hezbollah that come up, or others, the Muslim Brotherhood over the years, and others that emerge. And in the worst cases, people like ISIS and Qaeda, humiliated, desperate, subjugated, and politically impotent millions of Arab citizens will not just roll over and play dead. They will, like all human beings, they will try to figure out how do they feed their kids and have a decent life of some sort. So I won't go more into that because there's two, but I think what we're really seeing is not just the fragility of the last century of Arab statehood, but the imperfections of the Westphalian state of 400 years ago almost, or something. So this model is pretty much has run its course, and so we have now multiple sovereignties within individual states. If you look at Lebanon, if you look at Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, whatever. So that's the issue. It requires a separate discussion.
Do you really think, I mean, maybe that would be a great theme for a coming panel in this series? I mean, I like very much that analysis. I wonder whether it's really a generic problem of the Westphalian system, or rather more a mega regional problem of the developmental promise of statehood across the Middle East and, after all, large parts of Africa as well, where you see the same phenomenon, and its history is so dramatic, right? If you compare not necessarily the immediate reality, but the horizon of expectation in the Arab world in the 50s and 60s, or for that matter, in the post-colonial world in Africa in the same period, with the shattered expectations of the current moment, it is staggering how wide that gulf is. You see this across every area of culture. If you look at like Rai music and its culture in North Africa, or the extraordinary efflorescence of popular culture in both East and West Africa in the 60s and 70s, which is then dealt such a severe blow by the failure of development and the HIV/AIDS crisis. And the comparative development, this is after all what makes so stark then the trajectory of an Israel, which is a 50s and 60s developmental social democracy, runs into naked economic crisis in the 1980s with hyperinflation, and the fundamental basis of its current dominance, and I think also its relative autonomy in relation to the United States, is a sort of neoliberal, tech-driven economic miracle of the 90s and the 2000s, in which out of which a figure like Netanyahu emerges, and critical political economy coming out of Israel is very good in allowing us to understand this. So I agree. I think this fundamental tension is profound. And in a sense, I regret, I mean, maybe this again is for another panel, another time, that we haven't spoken about Sudan, because, you know, one of the logics of multipolarity is that some crises feature in this world and other crises don't. And there are very powerful reasons why that's true. And I don't for a second disagree that the Palestinian cause and its crises are emblematic of a kind of human struggle for a decent life and independence and autonomy. But it is extremely telling that on the one hand, we have a European obsession with Ukraine, we have a kind of global focus on Gaza, and all the time, at the same time, this extraordinary explosion of violence and the disintegration of the Sudanese state before our eyes, with many of the players that are involved in Gaza also being involved in the Sudanese case. I'd be fascinated whether anyone on the panel, Solly, if you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, I mean, 1994 was during the unipolar moment, right?
Yeah.
And there was a civil war ongoing in Bosnia. We were all obsessed with it.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, maybe 100,000 people died. That's too many.
Yeah.
And in that year, in only 3 months, and with just machetes, 800,000 people died in Rwanda. Who cared? So I really don't think it's about unipolarity and multipolarity. It's in terms of its relevance to the central powers in the world.
Yeah.
That may be a more accurate way of looking at it. And secondly, about this Westphalia system being under threat. And by the way, Boutros Ghali said this when he was the Secretary General, and he was like lynched. There are I mean, look at the United States. Someone like Elon Musk, the world's richest person, he's not elected, he's not appointed with any Senate confirmation, and he's trying to take over the American state along with probably his tech brothers. Now, are we going back to the times of the East India Company? I mean, where are the states fighting individuals or corporations that are far too strong for them to actually wrestle with? And that is a much more severe crisis, in my view, and that is something that we need to take into account, along with the mafia, which is now much more international, much more powerful, and much better armed, to discuss the future of the world order.
Yes, I agree. And on America's the doorstep of the United States, the situation in Mexico, which is truly, you know, a huge systemically important player, which has an internal security problem of really dramatic proportions, all of which then gets cloaked in the American-centric discourse of, you know, fentanyl and migration. But the actual question has got to be about Mexican statehood. Rami, I'd love to bring you back in.
Yeah, just a very fast follow-up to Solly's comment. What we saw at the end of the Cold War was the advent of the world's first disposable state, disposable in the eyes of the West, which was Somalia. When the Soviets and the Americans stopped, you know, playing games with Somalia, and the Somalis were clever, they'd go play them off against each other. But the end of the Cold War brought that to an end. Somalia no longer mattered to anybody. and they let it, and we see the consequences today. Sudan is in a similar situation. We are seeing the concept of disposable states that don't matter to the Western global powers. They matter to their own people. And these are wonderful countries. Every one of them is an amazing place, as we all know. But in the global power balance, they don't matter, they don't exist. And this is something that's becoming more evident. And this is one reason why the genocide in Gaza happens, and much of the Western world doesn't do very much about it. They just issue statements and things. So there is a real serious question about what is the role of global norms and powers around the world in preventing this kind of atrocity from happening. And I don't think we have any answer to that, but it's something that...
Rami, did China or Russia do anything significant during those 17 to 18 months?
In Gaza?
Yeah.
Not really, as far as I can see. So this is a global, yeah, it's not just the West. So that's what I'm saying. The first disposable, these are disposable countries. But when they fight back, they stop being disposable. And it's fascinating that the United States and Israel have fought their last war against non-state armed Arab actors supported by Iran. The Arab states were off having lunch in New York or Geneva or somewhere, but non-state Arab actors and Iran were the great forces, or the main forces, that were waging war with sophisticated weapons. And now if you look at the Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, with their capabilities. So there's a new dynamic afoot, and it's linked to resistance. It's linked to imperial colonial genocidal actions, and it's linked to the passive nature of the modern Arab state because of what I mentioned. The state is fragmenting, fraying, and slowly collapsing in many cases. So these are tough issues. The Arab people don't know how to deal with this because they don't have the power. They're not allowed to deal with it. So the best people immigrate. Some people join the corrupt system. Some people go off and form their own armed factions. And some people join terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And some people try to resist. There's all kinds of different responses, but that's for another discussion.
I have the unenviable duty of managing time on this fascinating conversation, and I think it is important. It's one of the privileges of Zoom is that we can meet from all over the world in a single place. One of the downsides is that there's also therefore a rather arbitrary quality to the fact that we have to cease the conversation and close things down. It becomes a choice. For me, this conversation has been really profoundly eye-opening. I'm left with this question, and I'll abuse my privilege as chair to put it into the realm without really answering it. But thinking about the way in which the comments by Sully and Rami connect with each other, whether or not it really is the end of the Cold War that creates the possibility of just these voids of relevance, right? Whether the bipolar Cold War, to take up Sully's point, didn't force, if you like, a series of global preoccupations. There was, there was no zone that was truly irrelevant. It was always just a question of which player would want to engage with those zones. That was, after all, the explosive dynamic of the Cold War in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And the end of the Cold War, whether it's the unipolar version or the multipolar version, has created these spaces which can, sort of by the consent of all of the players, be essentially left to disintegrate. That will be the Sudan case. In any case, this for me has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been a privilege to chair it. I'd like to thank all of the organizations, our global centers in Jordan and Turkey for making it possible, and our three distinguished panelists for their fascinating contributions this morning. And I'm sure I speak for everyone in saying I look forward to more conversations along these lines in the weeks and months to come. Thank you all for being here this morning.